My name is Harold Meyerson. I am the editor-at-large of a monthly liberal publication called The American Prospect, which was founded 21 years ago by Robert Reich and Bob Kuttner and Paul Starr. And I am an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. Usually I have a piece in every Wednesday, and I write occasionally about LA and California matters for the Los Angeles Times. Well, I'm not someone who either went to journalism school or started out to be a journalist. I went to Columbia University in New York in the late 60s and early 70s, which was sort of a tumultuous place in a tumultuous time. And I more or less finished up school in 1972 with the kind of financial security that kids in 1972 had, which they do not have today, and embarked on a semi-career of activism, for lack of a better word. I worked with and for a truly great person named Michael Harrington, who had written the book 10 years earlier, The Other America, which led to the War on Poverty, and who was America's leading democratic socialist. In a debate once with William Buckley, after Harrington was introduced that way, Buckley said that's kind of an unfair introduction. It's like being called the tallest building in Wichita. But a truly charismatic and brilliant guy. And that got me into doing work for and with a collection of unions, which were sort of at that point the dissident unions in the AFL-CIO, which had a very hard-line foreign policy for many years. These were unions that were opposed to the Vietnam War as opposed to the position of the AFL-CIO under George Meany, which was in favor. And these were unions which were willing to reach out to some of the newer movements that the mainstream of labor at that point was shunning. Student movements and inner-city African-American Chicano movements. At the time the word was Chicano. And I began to do some political work for them, in particular the Machinists, who at that point most American unions were considerably larger then than they are today. We're talking this is now the late 1970s. The Machinists had about 1 million members, and they were the leading union in most American defense plants and aerospace factories, and headed by an interesting guy with the impossible name of William W. Wimpesinger, known to his members and one and all simply as Wimpy, which he was anything but. He was this big guy, had been an auto mechanic, and he went around saying what we have to do is plan for a conversion to a peacetime economy. He'd go into the defense plants, he'd talk to his members, he would say things like, what can you do with a missile? You can't eat it, can you? And was a very interesting guy. So I did some work on the West Coast for that union of a political nature. And I then became actually a campaign consultant in the early 80s, when I'm in my early 30s, for a number of progressive causes and candidates here in Los Angeles and Southern California. I managed in 1986, not entirely my fault, to lose the entire California Supreme Court for the next 40 years. Jerry Brown, in his first go-round as governor, had appointed a controversial woman, Rose Bird, as his Chief Justice, and made another of other progressive appointments as well. What ensued was that California had a death penalty at that time. Rose Bird had voted to overturn 59 out of the 59 death sentences that had come before the Supreme Court. This rendered her politically vulnerable. What happened then was that two groups decided, because California Supreme Court justices are on the ballot every 12 years for a retention, ratification, or not, two groups had decided that that made her vulnerable and they could sort of remake the court. The first group was the Republican Party in California, led by the then Republican governor who had succeeded Jerry Brown, George Deukmejian, because they wanted control of the court so that they would get a better deal on reapportionment in 1990. Believe it or not, that was the issue for them. The legislature was going to be Democratic, and if the governor was Republican, it would fall to the court to do the districts, and they wanted that. The second group was agribusiness, because Rosebird had been Jerry Brown's first Secretary of Agriculture. The second justice targeted, a guy named Joe Groden, was the, as I recall, the first head of the California Labor Relations Board under Jerry Brown. In California, agricultural workers had gained protection under a labor law. A way was formed for them to form unions because they had been excluded from the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. So Joe Groden headed that, and the third member of the court was a guy named Cruz Reynoso, who had been the head of a nonprofit called California Rural Legal Assistance, which was providing, as the name suggests, legal aid to farm workers and other poor people in and around the many agricultural areas of California. So, the campaign that was waged against the justices was all about the death penalty, but all of the money was coming in from agribusiness and Republican Party circles. Anyway, they got wiped out, and my job was sort of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic on that campaign. But that was, I had a number of other campaigns that won, but this was probably the best known one, and that was a complete failure. So, anyway, around this time I had sort of reached a conclusion, because I was always writing on the side, and some of what I was initially writing actually wasn't about politics or labor or the economy. When I was at Columbia, I had been a student of Andrew Sarris, who was the sort of one of the two leading figures of American film criticism in those days when, as some might tell you, in those days when film criticism mattered. There was Pauline Kael at the New Yorker and Andrew Sarris at the Village Voice, but he was also professor at Columbia. And I had studied with him, and I wrote a bunch about old movies for places like Film Comment and whatnot. But I also wrote about different political things in kind of left-of-center journals. The magazine Dissent, which had been founded by Irving Howe back in 1953. And I had reached the conclusion pretty much by the end of the court campaign, and it wasn't a question that it was losing. I mean, it just reached its conclusion anyway. It was an existential, not a political conclusion, that I was a better writer and had more fun writing than I was a campaign manager, and had, and that ultimately I thought campaign consulting was sort of like being able to play checkers, and even if I was the best checkers player in the world, it was still just checkers, and that I would have greater impact writing. So I began to step up my journalistic output